Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Again, thank you for joining us for Know-It-All Inventory 101. My name is Darlene Bylowski, and as Erica said, I am president of the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance, or the CCCA. I am also by profession a contract museum registrar and a fine and decorative arts appraiser, and have been in the museum field for over 20 years. To those of you new to attending our webinars, I invite you to visit the AAA's website to learn a little bit more about our board and some of the events that we have offered in the past. We are a Vermont nonprofit comprised of professionals in the cultural heritage field, ranging from collections managers, registrars, archivists, and conservators, who have come together to offer our expertise to our colleagues in New England, the New England region actually, by providing educational opportunities and support in the caretaking of cultural heritage collections. And to those who volunteer at places which have collections, we are also as a resource here for you. And as well, a resource for the general public to help those know more about their heirlooms, how to take care of them, or what to do with them should they not want them. As a result of attending this webinar, we invite you to join us next week, Tuesday, September 28th, from 12 noon to 1 p.m. for a conversation with colleagues. The conversation with colleagues is a benefit of being a member of the CCCA, but for 2021, they have been coordinated with a webinar to act as a continuation of the discussion and open to those who have attended the event, whether or not a member. Our last educational webinar of the year is December 9th. It'll be on the hot topic of deaccessioning and is to be led by Matthew Powers, who's the executive director of the Woodstock History Center and also a professional member of the CCCA. His conversation with colleagues will follow the following week on December 16th. Details are still being ironed out, but you'll receive word of it as a result of joining us today. We encourage you also to subscribe to our mailing list, and if you are a professional in the field of collections care, an emerging professional, or a student, please consider becoming a member of the CCCA. It's a great networking opportunity, and we work hard to make it a primary go-to resource for our colleagues and the public alike. We also have membership levels for friends of the CCCA for those not working in the field, but who wish to help support the work that we do. So without further ado, allow me to introduce to you today our speakers who also serve as directors to the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance's board. First up, we have Eileen Corcoran. Eileen currently serves as Community Outreach Manager at the Vermont Historical Society, working mainly with local historical societies and museums around the state. She has 20 years of experience working with and for museums and other cultural organizations, including the Vermont Museum and Gallery Alliance, Upstate New York History Alliance, the National Museum of the Morgan Horse, and the National Museum of Natural History. She also serves as an independent consultant and contractor specializing in collections care and management. She earned her BA in Ethical College and her MA in anthropology with a concentration in museum training from the George Washington University. Eileen resides in Waltham, Vermont. Following Eileen, we'll hear from Rachel Onuf. Rachel is the director of Vermont Historical Records Program based at the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. She serves as a co-lead of the Vermont Arts and Culture Disaster Resilience Network, also known as VACDARN, and as a member of the Vermont Suffrage Centennial Alliance and the NEDCC Advisory Committee. Rachel received her BA from Swarthmore College, an MA in Library and Information Science from the University of Michigan, and an MA in American History from the University of Virginia. Past jobs include serving as roving archivist for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and Director of Archives at the History Center of Pennsylvania. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania. She taught as an adjunct at Simmons College of Library and Information Science and worked as a consultant for many years. She lives on a side hill farm near the village of East Orange. And Eileen, I leave it up to you now.
Great. Thank you so much, Darlene. And so excited to see everybody here. And we're going to start off a little bit wanting to get to know everyone. And so we're going to do a poll, and Erica's going to help start with that. And let's start with the poll on what your collections are. Hopefully it's okay. So what types of collections do you have? And feel free to choose any and all that you have in your organization. And once we get a good number of folks answered, we'll share those results.
Okay, it looks like we are slowing down in responses, so I'm going to go ahead and end this poll and turn it back over to you, Eileen.
Okay, what do we have? All right, so a good amount of archival materials, objects and books. So that's a great mix to see here. And I think, again, we have a nice little mix of different types of organizations and sizes. And so we're gonna try to give everybody a good baseline. Some of the stuff might be things that you know if you're sort of advanced, some might be brand new to you. But we hope that there'll be something a negative information for everyone at least. Okay, so I think Rachel is driving, so hopefully we'll make this easy as we go, but I think we can go to the next slide. And we just like to start with definitions to make sure that we're all on the same page. There we go. So what is an inventory? And an inventory is a list of things. And so you can see here a standard potential database list of things. It can also be an action. So next slide. It can be a verb, which is to create a list of things. And so the next poll we're going to do, Erica, if you want to launch that, is actually to ask who's done an inventory before. So who has verbed into a noun in the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, or no, you have not conducted an inventory. And I would say if you don't know, feel free to choose no, or maybe in the 20 years if you don't know, it's been that long.
Okay, looks like everyone has responded who wants to participate. So I'm going to go ahead and end this poll and then share those results.
Okay, great mix again. So some of you have done it in the last 5 years. Congratulations. A few more. It's been 10 years plus, or not at all. So again, hopefully, we'll go over some basics for those of you who haven't done it, and get you some good information to think about for your next inventory if you have. And so an inventory for a cultural heritage repository is really a collections management activity, or the product itself, again, the noun and the verb, that allows you to gain physical and intellectual control over your holdings. So the next question of the definition is, what do we mean by any of these items? So physical control is the idea of tracking the physical locations of your collections to ensure that they can be found. And so basically the idea is you can go from your database or catalog of information and find any object. And that is your physical control over the object. Your intellectual control is creation and maintenance of tools, such as your catalog or a finding aid or guide that describes the information about the objects to help you find the information, find the relevant materials, know more about the object. So good intellectual control is being able to take an object and go back to your database and find all the information on it. And what a good inventory does is to help you make and maintain that link between the physical and intellectual control. So you're really making sure that that link is there by doing the inventory, and really and ensuring that you are keeping that control underway in both directions. And we did also define holdings, which is all of your collections. So again, sounds like you all have different types. So why are we going to do an inventory? So one is to improve access to your collections. Knowing what you have and where it is, it can be very important to do everything else that you want to do with your collections. But it can also help you to improve the preservation of your collections. So an inventory, by looking at everything that you have, can help you determine both at an individual object or item level where there might be preservation or condition concerns. But it can also help you get a really big overall picture of where you are as far as, Are there items that are actively deteriorating? Do you have storage conditions that may be better or worse for certain items as you look through the entirety of your holdings and of your storage spaces, of your exhibit spaces? It can really help with your insurance coverage. Insurers love to know what you have. And the more specific that you can be, the more helpful that can be in determining the types of coverage you might need. If you need individual riders on certain items, it can be really great to help you refine the type of coverage that you need when you have that full list of everything. And it can also certainly help with things like theft. I know many organization that has had a problem knowing that something has been stolen or being able to tell the police that something has been stolen because they did not have an actual inventory on their collections. So at the very least, that helps you to know if something has gone missing or not. It can also help you with disaster or emergency preparedness. So again, working to assess the risks that you might have in a physical sense in your collections and your storage. And again, priorities for emergency preparedness and response. I'll talk a little bit about, when I get into active collections, about the ways in which inventory can help us to work on the priorities of our collections and how that can really work towards some of these secondary activities. I think next slide, Rachel. So I'm going to start today really talking about inventory and active collections. And active collections, for those of you who may or may not know, is an original sort of movement that was started by Trevor Jones, Rainey Tisdale, and Elizabeth Wood. And they really started thinking and getting together and working about the issues that we have as a whole, as museums, archives, and other cultural repositories with our collections. And the main sort of tenet behind it is the idea that we need leaner collections with greater impact. That we as institutions as a whole have an unsustainable amount of collections, and that the time has come for us to make hard decisions about them. That there are many factors that brought us to this point. That includes a lot of societal issues as it relates to material culture, as it relates to how museums and archives have and are organized. It has to do with the fact that collections are additive. You know, history is additive, even art is additive, archives are additive, that they're not, we're just putting more on, and we don't have the resources to be able to give everything care in the way that it needs to be if we don't make these decisions. And so, oh, we go back just a tiny bit, sorry. And so one of the things that I like to say, you know, about how this works with inventory and active collections is that part of active collections is having the collections work for you rather than you work for the collections. So your collections need to actively advance your mission. They can no longer just be things on a shelf that were collected 20, 50 years ago, but that are not something that really works for your organization anymore. And so the inventory can help you to know what you have, because that's essential to figuring out and prioritizing what are those collections that mean the most to you and your organization. What are the collections that are going to advance your mission the best? And then how can you then make those a priority and give them the best care and use them in the best way? Yes. So for an active collection standpoint, again, inventory can go a little bit one step further than some of the other things we talked about why inventories are important. So, and I want to say that active collections is just not just about deaccessioning or getting rid of collections. I think there's, you know, our first sort of thing as carers of collections, when we hear about things like we have too much, we have to get rid of it, is about deaccessioning. It's not just about that. And an inventory is not just a list of objects. An inventory is really a great tool if you make it something that works for you. And so it can help you with assessing your scope of collections. So when you go through and look at all the perhaps hundreds or thousands of items that you have in your collections as a whole, presumably you probably have a scope of collections that tells you what you should and shouldn't be collected. And if you have that list, can you sort of look at what your scope is? Does your scope reflect your collections? And do your collections reflect your scope? And what you really want to do is get to a point where your scope of collections and the collections that you have match, that they really work to form this. They are what they are, say, and they say what they are. Again, it can also help with deaccessioning identification. So again, looking at things as a whole in an inventory can make you, sort of able to see, are there items that we know can be put into the process of deaccessioning at our organization? A lot of times that might be stuff that's found in collections, or things that you didn't know existed, or items that you now know no longer fit the mission that you have. Again, condition care and review. So you can look at, are there priority collections in need when you're doing your inventory? Or again, are there storage areas that might be actively harming your collections, or ways in which you want to reorganize to prioritize? I like it to look at inventory and again, the holistic picture of the collections that it gives you as something that you can use to identify inefficiencies in the physical use of the storage that you have, or the spaces that you have. So I'll give an example. We at the Historical Society have been undertaking an inventory recently, our collections manager. And I will say we are one of the organizations that has been probably close to 20 years since we've done one. And they were all in boxes from when they had moved from an old storage place to a new storage place. And so part of the inventory was literally unboxing everything and freeing up a whole lot of shelf space that had been taken up for 10 plus years in these boxes because we had never done that. So I think that, again, having that picture that an inventory gets you as you physically go through those collection spaces and those storage spaces or exhibit spaces can really show you, oh, I need more room here, or this thing is on this space, but it can really be moved someplace else. Or you know what, we really need more shelves for X kind of collection because those are the priority for us. And I think it can also work towards looking at the inefficiencies that you might have in your procedures. And I'll talk about that in another slide in a second, but we as organizations tend to have a lot of manuals and procedures, which is great in many ways. But what we tend to do is get stuck over processing or over complicating these systems, especially for those of you who are small organizations. So if you're a larger organization, you might have the professional staff and the technology to be able to have a really robust data system. But if you're a small organization, trying to keep a catalog with upwards of 20 to 50 fields for everything can be very difficult. So I think looking at the inventory and really getting back down to the basics can help you to determine what are the essential things we need to do for what we want to do with our collections from a management, especially data management standpoint. And then again, the one thing about active collections is really spending the time, the effort, the resources on the important stuff. So as we prioritize, as we tier, as we rank, we're going to really say, okay, what's important, and let's spend the time and resources on that. And that's another thing that both inventory can help you to work to identify those priorities and how you spend the time on it. Next slide. So talking about sort of inefficiencies, another sort of tenet of active collections is something called more product, less process. So again, hopefully all of our manuals don't look like that giant book, but sometimes it feels like everything we're supposed to do looks like that giant book. And so again, working from overcomplicated cataloging systems into something that brings us to getting more done on a holistic level rather than getting caught up in the process on everything. And so this idea of more product, less process comes originally from a 2005 article by Mark A. Green and Dennis Meissner, specifically about archival processing and about sort of the idea that we tend to, as institutions, archives and libraries, but this works for museums as well, have unprocessed or underprocessed collections because we have such complicated collecting systems. And so thinking about the more product less process standpoint for an inventory, again, is working to set something up where what you're doing is getting stuff done rather than overcomplicating the process of doing the inventory. And we'll talk a little bit about a couple of ways you can think about that. But I think when you're setting up your system, ask yourself really, what is essential? What data do you absolutely have to collect or absolutely have to check back to your records to get to what you want to get out of this inventory? What are you going to use your inventory for? And we can't necessarily in this workshop, we can give you some information, but we can't tell you exactly how to set up your inventory because you might have different goals. Some of that, if you've never done an inventory before, or if you don't have a full catalog or a full list of your collections, the use of your inventory literally might be as your catalog. So there you're going to have different ways in which you want to set that up because of that use. If you're conducting an inventory as just a recheck of the last inventory 5 years ago, then you're going to be able to set up the things that you do and the ways in which you collect information differently. So, review and sort of think about what are you using this inventory for? What are you really trying to get to in the goal? And then use that information to set up how you're going to conduct it. And then what is attainable? So one of the issues I think with a lot of organizations, especially from an inventory or a cataloging standpoint, is we know we sort of need to do it and we get started with it, and then inevitably something else comes up, or we've made it too complicated and it takes too much time, and we get stuck. And again, it can be very tedious, and so it's really hard to keep going and keep finishing. So when you're starting the process, really look at what is attainable, what is realistic, and what can you do with the resources, the time, the money, and the people that you have to make this a successful project? Because nothing feels worse than getting there halfway and then having it either, get sort of dormant or be unfinished or not really accomplish what you needed to accomplish. Next slide. So if we're looking at our goals from the standpoint of an active collections mindset. So tiering is one aspect related to active collections. Within the active collections movement, tiering is really about ranking or prioritizing your collections. So taking that aspect of saying some collections are more important than others. So if you look at it from the standpoint of doing an inventory, you can tier your inventory information as well. So think about the information that you intend or think you want to gather. What is the essential information? What is something that's secondary about what you might want to do with an inventory? Is there something that you're thinking like, I think we might want to do this? And then maybe there's a third rank of things that you can think about. Like maybe we'd love to do this if we can have the time. And so once you have an idea about what those are, you get into sort of what I call the realism step. So active collections is really about realistically thinking about your collections and your resources and the abilities that you have, and saying, okay, so if we have these three, maybe these three steps are essential or secondary and are nice if we can do it, things that we want to do as part of our inventory. How long do each of those activities actually take to do? So let's say you're saying, okay, I want to do these 8 fields worth of information that we want to collect. Those are our essentials. But you know what would be great? We also want to take photos. But you know what also would be great? We also want to measure everything. And now you're starting to say, what do these things take for time and effort, and how does that add into our project? So something like taking photographs is a more resource intensive activity as part of an inventory project. It takes time to take photos. And you think, oh, well, it only takes me 30 more seconds to take 4 reference photos for an object. Okay, you have 500 objects, you have 1,000 objects, you have 10,000 objects. How long does that realistically add to the amount of time and effort it takes for you to complete your inventory project? So again, just being realistic, and that means time trial. So actually getting 5 to 10 objects out, saying if we collect or check or review only these fields, how long does that take? If we do these activities as part of it, how long does this take? Depending on your storage, do you say, oh, we have things that are in boxes. It takes X amount of time to look through every folder in a box. We don't have things in boxes. We have things just sitting in folders on shelves. How long does it take for you to actually pull something from a shelf, put it down so you can actually review it in the way you need to do it, put it back in its storage, put it back on its shelf? So again, really be realistic about the timing that it takes. And the last thing about active collections is prioritization. So can you think about your collections, or do you know your collections, to actually separate priority work out beforehand? So are there types of collections that are priority to you? And do you start your inventory there? Or are there locations that are a priority and you start your inventory there? So that the energy and the intensity that you have for inventory gets done on the objects or the collections that are most important to you. A lot of that will take work beforehand to know. And so that might be something that you might have to do for prep work, but that can really help you, especially if you have a large project, figure out where those priorities are. And so a couple notes about sort of some of the practical things for inventory, especially from an active collections mindset, is to create a system that works for you. So again, we can't tell you exactly how to do an inventory because it's going to vary on all these factors. But I will say to work hard to minimize your effort in your redundant activities. So if you have an existing catalog or database or spreadsheet even, use it. So the sort of the old style of inventory, not that there's anything wrong with it if it works for you, is the sort of separate inventory sheet that we all fill out as we go along. If you've already got all your information in a database, do you need to write it a second time, or do you just need to mark it as reviewed or change it in the database itself and sort of take away that secondary step of having to basically rewrite and recheck everything? Again, depending on how your information is organized and your collections are organized, you may or may not be able to do that, but think hard about where any redundancies are in how you're checking things. Teamwork makes the dream work. So I think for inventory, this is really something that I think is an activity, especially as moving it forward in a way that keeps it going and keeps it attainable to get done. Really has multiple people doing it together. So teams, usually again, 2 people are great, but that somebody is assigned the task for the information, the database, the computer, and somebody is working with the objects of the collections. And so I think that's really a great way of maximizing efficiency for most inventory projects. You don't have to, but I think it also helps then, again, for each teams or multiple people to really feel like everybody has a stake in getting this done. Preparation is key. And again, this is something where I don't think any of us could just sort of start an inventory tomorrow if we don't have things set up already. So don't skip on this preparation work, even though you really want to get to doing the inventory. So some of the preparation can be including properly marking all of your locations. So depending on how your storage is, it may already be well marked. You may have to go back in and do some locations. Make sure to also mark any of those sort of miscellaneous locations that collections end up in. So art's on the wall in people's offices or in the conference room, items in your exhibits that move around, anything that you may have that you use actively in outreach or other things that kind of move places, but have some sort of location ability for those. Establish your procedures beforehand for items that are found in your collection or might have a problem or an issue. So are you going to leave found in collection items on the shelf in the box and just have a label and come back to them? Are you going to pull them out and put them in some sort of other processing area to deal with them? How are you going to deal with, I haven't found something on a shelf that's supposed to be on a shelf? Are you going to do something right then and there with it, or are you going to mark it and come back to it at the end? So figure out all of that stuff beforehand so so that when you're doing it, you know what you're going to do as you go along. Again, clean up your databases as much as you can beforehand. That'll be really helpful. And to remember, just always create standards for any data. Again, especially if you're starting a new project or don't already have an established database, to make sure that everybody, especially if you have multiple people working on it, know what those standards are. And the last thing I like to say is to use visual cues to help the process. And these are indicators that, again, they're really helpful if you have multiple people working on that, so they know where you've started, where you've ended. You can also consider things like color-coded forms or Post-it notes on the outside of boxes of shelves, things like indicating when a shelf has been completed in inventory. Or again, if you want to leave a found in collections in place or something else, having something color-coded to tell people where those things are is really helpful. I think from the standpoint of active collections, things like visual cues, this is a very data-driven kind of project, even though we are handling collections. Visual cues can actually really help with a sense of accomplishment, which I think is very important for projects such as this. So how do we sort of remind ourselves, you know what, like, let's look at these, you know, shelves and see rows upon rows of wonderfully red color-coded tags that tell us how much we've gotten through. You know, for a little while, maybe it'll feel bad that you don't have a whole lot of red tags, but as you move through the process, I think it can really sort of offer a visual landmark for where you are and where you need to get to, that everybody can see and everybody has access to that information in the same way. So I think that's sort of what I had for active collections and inventory. Any questions right now? Again, you could put them in the chat or unmute yourself right now if you want to. Okay. Turn over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Eileen, and greetings, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for this presentation. I'm going to be speaking from the point of view of the archivist, but as you heard from what Eileen had to say, some of the tenets of active collections are based on archival tenets, largely the work of Meissner and Green in their more product, less process article, and the subsequent maelstrom and useful discussion within our profession that followed that. If there's one word I want you to remember from today, though, it's chunking. This is the way I like to talk about the archival approach to inventory, which is very useful if you're dealing with archival materials, which don't tend to be small or minor in number. When I worked at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the last time I actually had collections under my care, there our director liked to refer to the 20 million documents that we had in our vaults. There is no way you can inventory 20 million individual documents. So you have to start to think about them in groupings or chunkings or aggregates. Or how can you clump things? So archivists have been doing this for a long time, not just when we inventory, but when we catalog collections, when we do arrangement and description. We will maintain the records of the whole organization, the papers of the family as an entity, and describe them at that level. You can always describe things at a more granular level as it's warranted within those chunks. But we start with chunks, and I would recommend that you think about this not just for your archival holdings, but you can apply it to other formats as well. And I loved seeing that basically everyone on this call has most everything, you know, it's pretty typical. But yes, you have books and archival materials and material objects and artifacts and maybe some art as well. So you can think about your chair collection, for instance, as a chair collection, and you could inventory it at that level. Or your spinning wheels, poor spinning wheels, we always kind of drag them out as the example of a thing that most places have too many of and could probably do just fine with one. but there's a way you can inventory at this grouping level that permits you to still kind of flag, there's one really fine chair. There's also 45 other chairs that we happen to have accumulated over the last 75 years. So you can, but for this inventory pass, you can kind of gather information and not feel like you have to do a new record, even if you're just doing essential information, as Eileen said, that you don't have to put that same information in for each and every one. That's often what will kill an inventory before it gets very far, is that, oh my God, I am looking at a storage area full of whatever it is. But if it is a lot of artifacts, or if it is 3 boxes with hundreds of textiles in them, don't die on that hill. That stuff can be adequately described and assessed, inventoried, gained physical and intellectual control over at a higher level. So that's my big takeaway. I could be done now, but I will continue. I look to my own, again, I haven't had collections that I've had care of for many years. So you guys get to look at my stuff. I recently decided to pull out things I had put in boxes for the last 25, 30 years of my life. I tend to be a bit of a pack rat, not a hoarder, but a pack rat. And I just decided I had this really handy cubby that my dear friend had given me, an archivist, I will note. And I started just sorting things or developing chunks, if you will, of different types of things. This may not look organized to you, but it makes some sense to me. I have textiles, I have VHS tapes, I have my American archivists, I have documents, I have far too many small containers because I really like them. So I'm trying to group things together, books I might sell on eBay. So what these represent is different chunks, different. There's something that puts them all of a piece and in that same cubby together. My plastic bag collection and my playing cards. I'll stop, but you get the idea. And what I would do if I were to inventory this stuff, which is maybe the next step, is to create a record for each cubby. I'm not going to go into each cubby and start to talk about or write up or make a note of every single thing that exists in that cubby right now. I'm going to find a way to describe that information, describe that material that's in that particular cubby in a single record in my inventory spreadsheet, database, whatever I end up using. So you can approach your spaces and your collections in the same way. So Eileen talked a lot about preparation, but I'm also going to weigh in on preparation because preparation is about 95% of the inventory process. If you set yourself up well, you are going to be much more likely to succeed. And there's a lot of value to being thoughtful and intentional at the outset of this process. So you want to decide on the scope. My scope was the materials I happen to have retained over the last decades of my life that I now want to kind of see what I have. And yes, there will probably be some deaccessioning as well. So it could be that you want to do everything. And this is compelling if you feel like you can do it, because you will find out, I guarantee you will find out more about the collections you think you know than you thought you did, if that makes sense. You will be aware of new ways of seeing things and looking at them just by going through the process of doing a comprehensive, high-level view of all of your holdings. But if that seems too daunting, or if you've got good physical and intellectual control over large sections of your holdings, you absolutely can focus your scope on a single type, or the things that are accessioned but have been sitting in a backlog for a long time, or sometimes we talk about our front logs, the more recent accessions that haven't yet been made fully available. You could just do one format if you're like, you know what? Magnetic media is the most at risk of anything. That paper can wait. We're going to find out what the heck we have on VHS tapes and on all of these oral history audio cassettes, and we're going to really tackle those. But we need to know more about what we have in order to be able to approach that thoughtfully. You could also do it depending on space. There could be, the black hole closet where everything's gone to die and just it's time to open that door. So you're going to have to think about what your scope's going to be, and then the level of the inventory. And as you can tell, I would advocate trying to think of some aggregate, some chunk level that you could be doing the inventory at. You can think about that as collection level. If things are not formal collections, you could think of it as things that are in a single box together. This is just, it could be just your first pass, but you want to try to get a handle on material. Again, as Eileen was saying, so much is contingent upon the state of your collections and the level of your physical and intellectual control right now. So for some folks, this will be more of a verification process of a shelf read for those librarians out there, comparing what's on the shelf with what your OPAC records, what the report for that says you should have. But it could also be that you're creating a whole lot of original records that could then turn into a basic catalog of your material. You might, for certain purposes, if you are doing an inventory in preparation for a digitization project, you may well be doing things at a more granular level, at the item level even. Not saying that it's horrible to do that. I'm just saying if you haven't done an inventory, or if you've got a lot of material that you need to get some basic control over, try to think of ways you can get that level of control at a higher level than at the item, even if those things are objects. So not to bang on it too much, but you could inventory this box of letters from my best friend in 6th grade, or you could inventory each letter. And I would highly recommend you just describe, talk about, capture information at that box level. And I would not count how many letters are in there either. Think about, back to that time trial thing, how long it takes to count things. You can estimate, or you can stick to what you can measure with a ruler, and that's what you're going to be providing in terms of extent information for now. That said, if you've got someone who really likes to count and doesn't like to do anything else and is right there, you work with what you've got. And it may be that there's someone who would be really interested in doing that. And while they're at it, maybe they're going to make sure that they're in chronological order. And you can see how you're starting to already build in some of your other processing work that you might eventually do with this material to make it more accessible to researchers. I really want to bang home too that the purpose of this, we do inventories for ourselves, but all we do is in the interest of providing enhanced access and the ability for more people to use what we have, to know it exists, and to be able to bring it alive by you doing research in it, using it for telling their stories, and being connected and empowered to their communities through these resources that we all hold. One thing that can be a little tricky to think about is whether or not your collections have been accessioned or not. Accession records can form that kind of the basis for an inventory project, and you can work from those if you've got fairly consistent records. Often I've worked with smaller organizations that have spotty accession records. They might be highly detailed for some years, and then they don't exist for other years. So it's often kind of is this going to slow us down to try to take into account what the accession number is, or is it going to be useful? You can always just make accession number one of the things that you gather as you do your inventory, and not kind of make it, but not make that be the pivot point or what the inventory is dependent upon. You could also decide, that's what we're going to start with. We're going to do this as an accessioning project, and we're going to be able to prove that from this day forward, at least, we know all of these materials were in our custody. You must consider what available time, labor, and space you have in terms of what resources are going to be able to be brought to bear to do this work. And there's important need to set some sort of schedule and try to keep it from, as Eileen said, becoming the thing that's always sloughed off and is not actually gotten to ever. You can help with that by identifying who is responsible. And the other thing you can do is you can try to seek some funding. This was much more possible 10, 15, 20 years ago when there was funding out there for collections assessments, but it isn't inconceivable that you could find some support to help fund this project if you thought that bringing in some folks to do it would be helpful. But in most of your cases, I imagine you all and maybe some of your friends and other folks interested in your organization may be the ones who are going to be doing this work. And again, that idea of starting at the higher level, the highest level that will give you some meaningful information. And it may make your heart quail to think of going back and doing another inventory already, but know that that is something archivists love to think about our work as being iterative and dynamic. And it's not ever done, and it's cyclical, and some things warrant much more effort and resources than others. You will need to decide, as Eileen said, about what information you want to gather for each record you're going to create in your inventory, what's essential, what might be nice, and where you're going to put it, what your tool is going to be. It doesn't really matter. You absolutely, though, if you have something already, try to use that tool or find a way to use it. If you have materials in Past Perfect, is there a way you can find some of those hundreds of fields that could be used to identify the information you want to use to verify that an inventory was done and by whom, and what other notes you might want to take the opportunity to gather while you're doing that work. It could be that it's a simple Excel spreadsheet. That works for many places I've been to. If you, a step kind of more sophisticated than that would be to have some sort of database. I'll be showing you a Microsoft Access database in a bit, or a collection management system like Past Perfect that might accommodate some inventory data as well. And it may be that the kind of inventory you're doing, you are basically just working with the basic fields that already exist in that collection management system. You definitely want to gather any existing information and documentation you have, whether those are paper records about accessions or existing databases or inventories. And that can be an effort in and of itself, especially if there's been a transition recently. I've seen many electronic files lost from one shift to another as personnel have changed, especially at volunteer organizations. So another kind of separate thing to just be mindful of. Make sure that whatever inventory you produce is not kind of locked away in your own personal electronic space. And standards are good. I'm not gonna say you must use Dublin Core or controlled vocabulary, but try to be consistent in how you are using words and language as you populate the various fields or elements that you've decided you want to try to gather information for. And it's really valuable to try to see beyond the inventory itself. It's really, its intent should be that it's a springboard that lets you and your organization more fully realize your mission. It should energize and activate your programs and exhibits. It should provide exciting new finds to share with your researchers and your publics. So it's gonna give you so much back in return. It's very much worth taking the time to spend some time with your collections. And depending on what your role is where you are now, it may be that you are doing much more administrative work, or maybe if you're getting into the collections, it's to answer specific inquiries that researchers have asked. This is kind of a luxury for people who love the material, like we all tend to do. It's why we do this work. It gives you an opportunity to spend time with your collections and to get to know them better. And that's a real gift. So this can be a really beautiful time for you to spend more time with your materials. It can be a great team building exercise as well. And it is great to do this work with other people and not just on your own. But I certainly know instances where people have have plugged away and done it solo. Erica might even be one of those first people who's done it on her own. So a lot depends on, again, what resources you have available. But good to think about strategically, and this is part of the planning and preparation. And again, very contingent on where you are at, where your collections are at. But think about how the records you're creating might be able to be used in the future, and what they might allow you to do. And are there other things that would be really useful to be gathering, and it wouldn't take a whole lot more time to do so at this point? And again, with that enhancing access for the public being your primary motivator. So I want to talk about assessment, because this is it's kind of the value added thing you can do when you're doing an inventory. So Eileen and I have both alluded to, essential information. And by that, just to spell it out, and I'm sure I'll forget some essential fields, but talking about like title, creator, date range, extent, those are kind of the basics. Probably a description, a brief description, location. Again, we need to know where the heck it is to establish that physical control. That's kind of the basic bare bones stuff. That's all good, and it'd be great to gather that. But especially if you already have that essential information for the majority of the material that you are going to be engaging with, consider doing some assessment work as well. And this gets a bit to, in active collections, it's called tiering, and it's a way of looking at kind of the significance of these holdings to your mission, and can be very useful in determining how much effort and time you want to spend on any particular object or collection. And I love the way that active collections emphasizes spend your resources on the things that matter. Don't be spending time on how to get rid of the small little bits that you need to deaccession. How can you really focus on those important, significant holdings that are going to be really impactful for your public? I like definitions, so I'll just start with a general definition for assessment. Evaluation or estimation of the nature, quality, or ability of someone or something. So for our cultural heritage repositories, we talk specifically about collection assessments, which is the evaluation of the nature or quality of your holdings or some subset of them. I like using qualitative as well as quantitative fields to gather information. So you get words, you get language, you get sentences that we can comprehend as sentences, but you also get numbers, which can be very useful when you want to try to find averages and set priorities. It can be easier to do that based on quantitative, do the number crunching, a very modest level. This is not expert statistics by any stretch. So if you have not, or if the idea of adding assessment to your inventory makes you want to rethink your scope and the level at which you're going to be doing this inventory and assessment work, you want to consider where you're going to approach, how much you're going to do, and at what level, and what are you assessing. There's all sorts of things that you can do. I'm going to be showing you a bit of information describing a large survey project I did back in the Stone Age in Philadelphia at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And these are the ratings that we were looking at. We were assessing the condition of the material, the quality of the housing, the physical arrangement, intellectual access, research value, and I'll get into these in a bit. Local value, sometimes there's a sense of like, this is something that the people here really care about. I'm not sure why, but it seems to have some sort of touchstone characteristics to it. So that that's something worth noting. Sometimes things are absolutely beautiful and they're going to add a lot of visual interest to an exhibit, but in and of themselves, they're not especially valuable to your organization. But that's something you might mark, like, well, we like to have eye-popping exhibits. We're going to hold this for that. As with the basic inventory project, you need to think of what kind of a methodology you're going to use, and have some sort of survey instrument or spreadsheet database where you're going to put this stuff. So as I said, back in the Stone Ages, 2000, 2002, I was the coordinator for this survey and assessment project at HSP and had a team of 7 people working on this. So this was a grant-funded project. We did it for 18 months. Initially, we were supposed to survey the backlog, but in short order, I determined that actually all of the collections could be considered backlog because of the minimal ability that researchers had to access them, and the very spotty physical arrangement and quality of the housing that they had. So we decided to, again, that kind of holistic, comprehensive approach, we decided we would go through even the authoritative collections that had already been established at the Society. We had other duties to do as well, because one thing I will say is it's very difficult to survey things and assess them for 8 hours a day. You are making decisions, and after 2 or 3 hours, a lot of fatigue will set in. So even, think of that too as you think of your time frame for your inventory project. Don't try to get too much done all in a brief period of time. Your brain will hurt, and you'll stop making really good decisions. We did these quantitative and qualitative ratings and added some narrative notes as well. And the deliverables included just this comprehensive knowledge of holdings at the collection level, so high level, but that was better than we had before. We also were able to, in addition to the 7 different card catalogs down in the research room and the printed guide to manuscripts, we were able to now share information with researchers in electronic form by sharing our Access database with them that had, again, standardized information about the collections in it. And it also really helped develop a prioritized path forward for us by those quantitative numbers that we could say, these collections are the best collections in the worst condition. And that was a really compelling thing, a compelling story to tell about our holdings to funders. So just some pictures, because I can talk and talk, but nothing kind of says it like some images. So there are 12 different very large storage areas at HSP. This was one of my favorites, the 4th floor vault. Spent a lot of time in there. And my job as the coordinator was to kind of spelunk out in front of the team and identify where a collection started and where it stopped, because that was not always obvious on the shelves. So I would be mapping, and the shelves were numbered. The mapping of the stacks had happened in most spaces, not all, but it was not always clear when one box started and then, when collections stopped and another one started. These green monster boxes, as we called them, could have many collections in them, or go on for 50 or 100 boxes for one collection. There are also over 10,000 leather-bound volumes on the shelves and stacked on the floor. Lots of boxes, both kind of the rustico and more elegant archival. I had wonderful team of surveyors. Many of them were just graduated from college and history majors and very passionate and enthusiastic. And occasionally we found things that made them very sad. So this is a collection we pulled out from somewhere of incredibly tightly rolled documents. And we all just took a chance to kind of express ourselves and how they made us feel. And then we got back to the business of rating things, which again, it was a grind, but the value we got out of it was wonderful. And I like to think that HSP is continuing to benefit from the prioritization work we did during that survey project. So with these, what I call the tangible ratings, 1 was a low and 5 was a high. We were again looking at the physical condition, which was the material itself. And you can think this could be tricky if you're looking at, you kind of got to decide what the average condition is over a 50-box collection, where some stuff might be, really compromised and torn or in pieces, and other parts might be pristine. How do you quantify that? But you can do it. It can take some time to kind of calibrate and figure out how to make the ratings meaningful. And I felt very confident that our ratings were meaningful. Not everything just ended up in the middle. It really didn't. Things did kind of spin out. Intellectual access, and this was challenging because there was so little access to the holdings. So we had to kind of, and this is where we would have, in addition to the numbers, we would explain what each number meant. And I'll show you an example for this moment. Quality of housing, and for those leather-bound bindings, we called the binding the housing because they were usually not in boxes. And we had to do this because there were so many collections that were in acidic boxes. And that was, again, a good thing to measure because that is then becomes a specific need. We need to have better archival housing for our materials. And then physical access or arrangement. How easy is it to find what you might be looking for? Is there kind of an inherent original order that stands, or is this chaos? So this is just an example I took the condition of material rating to see how we would write out what each number means. And we did spend a couple weeks kind of surveying all together very slowly and deliberately, and then breaking into teams and then talking about our ratings and having other staff members come in and weigh in on how we were rating things, just to kind of, again, get that kind of consistency and calibration across the team for what we meant. I think that in some ways the more controversial is overstating it, but the rating that some organizations that adopted this survey model and used it for their own holdings, including Columbia and WGBH, some of them did not do the research value rating. But this is, I think, the one that in many ways is the most important, because it's the one that's outward facing, right? It's not telling us like how many new boxes we need to get. It's telling us these are the collections that researchers are really going to love or really need to know about, because there's a high interest in this topic that this collection's about. And the quality of documentation, the depth and breadth with which that interest topic is represented in these holdings is really wonderful. It's very rich, very deep. So we would have to the research value rating is a combination of these two. So are the subjects that are represented of really high interest to our users or our future hopeful users, and how deep and good is that documentation. So could have a 2 to a 10. And the way we prioritized was anything that got us a research value rating of 7 or above, we considered a priority collection. And it became very useful to use this in combination with the condition rating, because if it was a high research value collection with a really poor condition, that was something that became a priority. And just to take, show you what I with some help, I made this Access database. I am not a database maven, but it worked pretty well. So again, some of your basic inventory information, the main entry, the type of collection it was, a title, the dates, bulk dates if they existed, linear footage, number of volumes, number of boxes. We do have number of items. That was only if that was sometimes provided in the printed guide. So we would gather information if it already existed, but some of it we wouldn't bother trying to populate the fields for. The locations, we also had places for legacy information like old call numbers. And then that's kind of the essential info, what we considered essential. And then we had our survey ratings and tried to actually estimate the processing time for a collection as well. So this is the Forges and Furnaces collection of bound volumes, 934 of them, all relating to forges and furnaces in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. and we thought it would take about 1,500 hours to process them, which is nearly one person's entire year of work. So you can see, but you start to be able to measure things. Again, that was just kind of we're throwing that out as, can we try to estimate how long it takes to process things? Because that was something that was super mysterious. How long is actually an appropriate amount of time to spend on a collection? And there's real value, as I said, in these qualitative notes where you talk about your ratings or give rationales. And you'll see that in here, there was also a field for the CCAA, which is the Regional Conservation Center in Philadelphia. We got a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, specifically to have them come in and look at the high research value collections that had poor condition issues and give recommendations for what could be done. And this was reasonable to do in part because we had, as part of the grant, we had hired folks who had hand skills. And we had people doing conservation work as well as survey work. Much of that was what we would call technician work. They were making boxes, but we had an old conservation lab that we were living in at HSP, and we were able to do some washing of papers, flattening of materials, and some modest repair work as well. Again, the focus was not on the item level for this project, but we had the ability to do some things. And again, using the momentum that this survey gave us to seek out funding. The other thing about that NEH grant is it was then a stepping stone to a much larger NEH grant that we were successful in getting. We also tracked information about the survey process. So who did the data entry? We all had, because we were funded by the Mellon Foundation, we were the Mellons, and various team names were Mellon names. But on occasion, like this big collection, we would all come together and do it together. And we spent an hour on the survey, just to give you an idea, 934 volumes. This was in 2001, so we'd been surveying for a while, and there's a certain kind of sameness and inherent understanding of what type of record this was. It was all basically, they were fairly similar. So we didn't have to kind of jump into a lot of different volumes the way we might have to with a more complicated collection of papers that encompass 5 generations of a family, where it may be that it takes a little longer to try to get a sense of what the holdings actually were. I do just want to note that the HSP survey methodology was incorporated into ArchivesSpace, which is one of the collections management tools available for archival materials. It's open source, and they've done a much more, they've really expanded. I worked on this project briefly many years ago as this module was just being developed, and they've really expanded what's included in there, so you can capture all sorts of information that might be of interest and use to you as you're assessing your material. But this is an example of kind of building in assessment information into what is a survey database, which is an inventory database, which is ultimately how you're managing your collections. Another deliverable of this project was physical stabilization. As I mentioned, we did have conservation techs who could do some wonderful work, and we left those vaults, cleaner, more orderly, and materials better protected at the end of our 2 years. It is good to spend a little time wallowing when you're first setting up your inventory. As I said, we took about 2 weeks to do it at HSP. And you want to try out both typical things and atypical things to see if they're going to fit within what you are expecting in terms of the information you want to gather, and how you're going to present that in your tool. It's also really important to document what you're doing. So if you're putting red dots on shelves that you've finished, somewhere make it clear what the red dots mean, please. One thing that we saw at HSP is there were lots of dots on all sorts of things, and we didn't have the key. We didn't know what they meant. So good documentation of your approach, what went well, what didn't, why, that's all useful to do as well. And consistency is really important. So just, again, don't get too hung up on standards if that's not your bag, but try to be consistent. If you're going to be gathering people's names, do last name, comma, first name all the time, or do first name, last name. Just do it the same way each time. So adding in assessment really does help with prioritization. So as long as you're doing this inventory, you might take it a little bit further if it's at all possible. And it does then, it can really motivate and make compelling proposals that you can put forward to funders for. At that point, we did a lot of processing we got our institutional archives processed through an NHPRC grant, and we got funding from the NEH for our most endangered, most valuable collections, and some state funding as well for specific collections. So it also made it possible for us to collaborate more with the other organizations in the Philadelphia area, which has a very robust special collections environment. But you know more about what you have, you can more effectively work and do shared exhibitions with others and other shared things. So Eileen, I'll just go through some last thoughts, and then it looks like I'm hoping that seeing that number in the chat means we've got some questions. So be realistic about the amount of work that you are able to do, and do practice and do trials. Do what is necessary. You can try to set up a stretch goal if you would like, but try to be realistic about what you're going to be able to accomplish it. And I think we're giving you permission to flag problems and not deal with them immediately, because that could send you down multiple rabbit holes. But try not to just, take things off the shelf and go, oh, well, not that one. Be aware that there has to be a process for how you're going to manage the things you don't want to deal with. But one point on that, back to that, spend time on the stuff that matters. One mechanism we had at HSP was we got all in a tizzy about the things that had really cruddy research value ratings, like a 2 or a 3 or a 4. And the collections committee spent hours and hours reviewing those records and making sure, like, is this something we really want to deaccession, and who could we transfer it to? And in most cases, these were very small collections. And we realized it was just we should just put them on the shelf, and they live on the shelf as a 3, and that's fine. But it was not worth the effort it was taking to try to find another home for them. We were spending all this time on things that don't matter. So do stick to the stuff that you really want to focus on. I think we'll stop there. And yeah, thanks for your attention, and look forward to your questions and comments. Please, it sounds like many of you have done inventories in the past, and we'd love to have you share your thoughts as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel and Eileen. That was great. We have about a little less than 15 minutes left today, and we do have quite a number of questions that have come through in the chat. So I will pose some of those questions for folks, but also make sure that we leave some wiggle room for people to unmute themselves and pose another question directly to our presenters. First, a couple points of clarification that were asked. One person asked if we could define what an accession is and what an accession record is versus a catalog record.
Sure. It's common good practice when you either buy something, if you have the luxury of buying materials, or more likely you are donated something, that you create an accession record that documents that thing came into your repository on a certain date, that gives a brief description of what it is, that links it to the donor, and where you've put it. And again, you could have a lot of information that you capture at point of accession, but it may just be that you've assigned an accession number to it. Typically, that is the year, followed by a period, followed by, and again, we put in spaces now for anticipated donations or accessions. So if you think you might have 100 or less, you'd probably do 2021.001. would have been your first accession this year. I've seen some extremely elaborate accession number systems that have M's and A's and P's in them to denote different formats. I would just encourage you not to try to make your accession number do too much for you. So it's typically in an accession record, you'll have an accession number that you then can put on the box that the thing is in. If it's a big, and again, you can accession things in, you got it, in chunks. So that's something to bear in mind at that level as well. And you can then, so you have an accession number, a name of the donor, the title of the thing, a brief description, and your location of where it is. So that can be the basis for that can then become, that can kind of be effectively your catalog. And it could effectively be your inventory, you know, what you would go back through to inventory your materials down the road. You would check against the accession records. Eileen, jump in if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, this is sort of getting granular into how you set up your collections management systems.
Yep.
And for some smaller organizations, there might not be a lot of difference between an accession record and a catalog record. Whereas for larger organizations with larger collections, you know, your catalog record is really that fine detail on when you're talking about objects, individual objects, or individual collections and archives. And so again, I think thinking about them as separate things really is going to depend on your organization. And you might not have to if you're a small organization. It's just the record is the record, and that's, you know, what it is.
Especially if you're not able to reconstruct who donated it to you, and you don't have any associated deeds of gift that you want to link to that accession, you're better off I would just say, you could think of it as creating your catalog or doing an inventory, creating an inventory, and don't lose sleep about that. But perhaps develop practice for moving forward from this point forward. You know, starting in 2022, maybe you are going to accession things, or you're just going to continue to catalog them. It doesn't really matter. As long as you have some sort of intellectual and physical control over your materials. So however that it's going to be possible for you to do that.
Thank you. So another question that came in right about the time that we were transitioning from one presenter to another, and I just want to go back to it and kind of make sure that we've addressed it, which is, please say more about active collections versus archives. And I think what that person is getting at is, are you discussing different approaches here? Please chime in if I have misinterpreted this question.
Yeah, so I think just to answer, I think the way of, and what might be confusing, you know, active collections and sort of the active collections movement and idea can cross different types of collections. So it can be for your objects or archives or even libraries. It's sort of a more holistic view. So when I'm talking about, you know, the active collections piece, I come from a museum standpoint, an object-based standpoint. And so that's where, you know, I'm sort of talking through. But in and of the fact, there's actually a lot of crossover between sort of some of the active collections and what we think about for archives and archival processing that's a little bit different than for objects in the traditional sense of how they're thought of. So I think you can think of active collections for objects, but you can think of it for archives, and kind of back and forth, again, depending on your organization. If you're a large organization, those distinctions are something that might matter. If you're a small organization, sort of having one process or one mindset about how you treat collections or how you treat cataloging or inventorying. Again, you don't need to overcomplicate by breaking things apart.
I think for me, the most valuable thing, and these two are not in conflict, I think they're complementary and align very well, that active collections, what that brings to our consideration of doing an inventory project or management of our holdings more broadly is this idea of making the collections work for you, that they really have to be manifesting and able to help you share your mission with your public. If they're not doing that, you've got some serious questions for those collections. So that's what active collections brings, which I think is really exciting, because it puts that user, that person who's coming into and engaging with your materials, puts them front and center. But that's what I love about active collections. And I think what the archival approach has to give to an inventory process is this idea of you can inventory in groupings. You don't have to try to do every single thing. I know someone, bless them, who's been doing textile inventory, and it's every single, and there's thousands of them. And after a while, it's another tea cloth. And it's tough, you don't necessarily need that level, at least for a first pass, so.
Thank you. I think we have several questions or comments that have come through that would follow, or a nice follow-up to what we've just addressed, which are folks who are thinking about, contemplating using an inventory process to identify strengths and weaknesses in their collection and perhaps do some streamlining. So we've had one person who wrote in and said, who's looking for, who said, it's okay, is it okay to cherry pick from our collection? And then another person who's looking for tips for that streamlining process, how to make those decisions.
Yeah, and I think, again, and I think it was Anne, the sort of the cherry picking thing. And I think that's, again, when active collections first came out, the sort of the horror of the idea that we had to think about possibly getting rid of some things, that all gives us the like, oh no, we're not cherry picking. But again, I think that, and this is a whole other workshop that we've done, have done, and can do, about sort of thinking about things in an active collections way. But I think it is, again, there's a lot of prep work. There's a lot of really sort of knowing, what I say is know yourself. Like, you as an organization really have to know yourself, know what your mission is, what it means, and then how that impacts what your collection should be and what you want to do with it. And then again, that you can really make decisions about, are there things that aren't actively working for us as collections? And I think that you can make decisions. Now, there's some differences as it relates to things like archival collections and keeping them together or not, that I'm sure Rachel can speak to. But I think that we do have to say, okay, we can prioritize what things are and what we can keep and take care of. And again, just because it's not the best for our organization doesn't mean that it's necessarily not good for any organization. So, also thinking of the mindset that there might be things that would work for somebody else and somebody else's mission, or that they might work in a different way, and to think about collections as usable objects if they're not part of your permanent collection. So education kits, outreach kits. I think there's a question about objects for online presentations, but do you have these sort of low priority objects that come into your collections, and maybe you don't want to give them the top care, but are there cool things that you can take out to, family day and kids can play with them and you don't care if they get broken, but they're a fun access and outreach point. So I think we can think about, again, active collections, thinking about these things from a sort of a slightly different mindset. Hope that makes sense. I could go on for years.
Thank you, Eileen. That's great. It's 3:27. I just want to be mindful of time. We do still have several questions that have come through in the chat, but I know that we wanted to reserve time at the end of this session for Darlene, just to give us some information about another program that we have coming up next week. So I think at this point I'm going to call it and say we'll address additional questions in a follow-up email, and in that email we'll also include a link to the recording for this session. For those of you who want to revisit it, as well as anyone who registered for this program but wasn't able to attend live. So thanks so much to Rachel and Eileen. And Darlene, over to you for some parting words.
Sorry, can you all hear me now? Great. Okay, thank you so much for joining us today. Eileen and Rachel have certainly provided a lot of excellent material, and I know that you're going to want to re-listen to the recording and talk amongst your colleagues and associates about, fine-tuning things for your institutions. So look forward, as Erica has just mentioned, to that recording link coming, should be in a few days. In addition to what's been offered today, I also wanted to mention about a few publications that are out there to help you with features of inventorying. Both Eileen and Rachel have mentioned the Active Collections movement, and you can find the book titled Active Collections by Rainey Tinsdale. It's a great resource and is available through her website, which is activecollections.org. Another reference I'd like to encourage you to look for is Managing Previously Unmanaged Collections by Angela Kipp. Full disclosure here, I am a ghost editor for the publication, which came out back in 2016 and is published by Rowan and Littlefield. Angela takes the point of inventorying and that conversation from walking into a collection which is largely not organized and helping you not turn around and run through the doors and scream and holler. She breaks it down into various steps that you can consider due to whatever your situation is and how to not shoulder the responsibility of the project on your own. So take a look for that and add it to your library if possible. Just as a reminder, watch for the link for the for joining us for Conversations with Colleagues next week. And that will follow on the discussion of today's inventory webinar. So next Tuesday at 12 noon. And then again, our last event for the year will be on December 9. And that is the conversation that we'll have with Matt Powers on deaccessioning. And his webinar will focus on trying not to be so involved with thinking about the deaccessioning process as a whole big idea, but breaking it down for your institution and knowing what you can and cannot proceed with at any particular time, and realizing that it is a process that takes time to not only understand, but to work through for your institution and your collection. And that webinar's Conversation with Colleagues will follow the following week on December 16 at 12 noon. So we hope that today's webinar has given you some new tools to implement, some options to consider for your own special needs in your institution, or just maybe a reassurance that there's light at the end of the tunnel and that everyone is focusing on the same tasks when having to inventory. And again, if you haven't already subscribed to our mailing list, please do so by visiting our website and clicking the link at the bottom of the page, and also consider joining us as a member, especially if today was beneficial for you. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event.
Thank you, everyone.